This is the most important plane in World War II. Well, not this one. This is a model. It's only important to me, and that's only because I built it. Plane it represents the P-38. That's the most important plane in World War II, and I'd argue should probably crack your top 5 most important planes of all time. Why? Aside from being the only fighter the US mass-produced during its entire time in the war, being the steed of America's top 2 aces, still to this day, and bringing the hammer of justice down on Yamamoto, the psychopath that orchestrated the Pearl Harbor attacks, it also taught the designers lessons in aerodynamics that revolutionized aeronautical design. Lessons that were not only applied directly to planes at that time, but are still applicable today. And it did it all without so much as a thank you. Let me explain. In the mid-1920s, the US military had come to a bit of an impasse. After the success of the air warfare in World War I, it became an issue as to who was going to be in charge of the planes now. With growing isolationist sentiments in the US, resources that Congress was willing to dole out were becoming more and more scarce. On top of that, the Navy began to tighten the screws to try and eliminate the Army Air Corps. After aircraft carriers had shown to be useful during the war, the Navy wanted the resources to build their own aircraft carriers. This would give them a distinct range advantage, especially given the literal oceans between the US and pretty much any potential foe.
What ho? A foe? Come on, you want a piece of me?
In response, started in 1926, the US Army began to develop what became known as the bomber doctrine. Essentially, the idea was that in the event of another war, heavy bombers could be used to do daytime strikes of supply lines, manufacturing centers, and even encroaching naval vessels. A heavy bomber can't be launched from a boat, which means you're going to need an Army Air Corps base, which means you're going to need an Army Air Corps. Plus, they were under the impression if you load up a group of heavy bombers with enough tail gunners and side gunners, they could fight their way through any oncoming airplanes, so there wouldn't be any need for pursuit planes at all. Checkmate, atheists. The eventual goal of this doctrine, besides I do literally think they thought it was a good idea, but also if you proved the heavy bomber so useful, you could argue to separate the Army Air Corps from the Army, and then it would never have to fight for resources again, which it did, but that's a different story. Various of these ideals became known as the Bomber Mafia by the detractors, and they permeated basically the entire top of the Army Air Corps. They include people like General Henry Harley Hap Arnold and Major James Doolittle. These sentiments would be redoubled during the Great Depression when resources became even more strict. Now, while all that is happening, out in Burbank, California, 2 brothers by the name of Robert and Cortland Gross are putting in a bid along with their friend Walter Varney to purchase a recently failed small aircraft manufacturer by the name of Lockheed Aircraft Company. They won this bid and immediately went about trying to make their first plane. To develop this plane, they sent a model of it to the University of Michigan where it would undergo wind tunnel testing. The grad student in charge of doing this wind tunnel testing was a young man by the name of Clarence Leonard Kelly Johnson. Kelly discovered that the plane was directionally unstable in low-speed maneuvers. He brought this up to his advisor, who told him to shove it and told Lockheed that it was all good. Kelly decided that was pretty uncool, so as soon as he graduated, he went and got the first job he could at Lockheed as an engineer, being a tool designer. Pretty much upon arrival, he went to chief engineer Hal Hibbard and convinced him of the instability. Hibbard believed him, unlike his professor, and sent him back to Michigan to do more testing. There, Kelly implemented what would become kind of Lockheed's call sign, the two-tail or H-tail design. This fixed the instability immediately. The resultant plane would be called the Model 10 Electra, the plane that Amelia Earhart used on her ill-fated attempt to circumnavigate the globe. But despite that unfortunate set of events, the plane was a success, and as a reward for his efforts, Kelly Johnson was promoted to an aeronautical engineer. I pray to God one day I'll have the self-confidence Kelly Johnson did to get a job halfway across the country, immediately walk up to his boss and say, "You're wrong, this is bad, let me fix it." And good on them for rewarding him. If I correct my boss, I get a scowl. Anyway, following the success of the Electra, Lockheed entered a design competition to build a bomber destroyer. Basically, the way this works is the military, in this case the Army Air Corps Material Command, puts together a list of requirements in what they call a circular proposal and distributes that to trusted designers and manufacturers, and then they put together a design, present it to the military, and then they get graded on a score of 0 to 100, and then whoever gets the highest score gets the contract. Like I said, this one's for a bomber destroyer, which is basically a multi-person fighter that is ideally faster and more nimble than any bombers, and has like 3 gunners on it so it can intercept and shoot down any bombers coming. Ideally. They didn't really work out in practice, but the Army wanted one and Lockheed wanted money, so they entered the competition. Unfortunately for Lockheed, their XFM2 design ended up losing to Bell's XFM1 Aracuda design by just 0.4 of a point. First Lieutenant Benjamin Kelsey, the lone person at military command in charge of fighters, was particularly impressed by their tricycle landing gear. It's more stable as tail dragging planes tend to nose over, so he really liked that. He tried really hard to get a joint contract so both companies could develop planes, but with the restricted resources and whatnot, that was not going to happen. I say unfortunately, but that's only because that's how it must have felt at the time. In the long run, there was only 12 Aracudas ever made, and it ended up being a huge waste of time and resources. However, what this did do was familiarize Benjamin Kelsey with the current edition of Lockheed, and in particular, the young Kelly Johnson. Kelsey quickly began putting together a set of circular proposals for 2 new interceptors. He applied the term interceptor because, unlike a lot of his contemporaries, he wasn't part of the bomber mafia and didn't really believe in their ideals. What he saw was the need for long-range fighters that could go out and engage the enemy, fight other fighters, defend the bombers, and maybe even carry loads and do strikes themselves. But there are a couple issues with this. One, the Army Air Corps had banned all external tanks on monoplanes for fear that a tracer round would explode them, so any of the fuel they had to carry would have had to been carried internally. And 2, because of the now very prominent isolationism in the US, even if they could get this past the Army Air Corps, they couldn't get it past Congress or the War Department. They had set a strict requirement that all pursuit planes, or what we call fighter planes, couldn't carry armaments of more than 500 pounds. The thinking, I guess, being that limiting armaments would both save on resources and allow us to look dovish in the eyes of the world. You may notice this in direct contrast to our current air power directives, which looks less like a dove and a lot more like a bald eagle, carrying akimbo ARs. Kelsey knew that this limits were never going to do, and he wanted at least 1,000 pounds of armaments for the task at hand. He also wanted it to be screaming fast and have a really high ceiling of operation. Before even officially putting together his request, he began contacting manufacturers, gauging what they could do, and then trying to also prepare them for the request. And in May of 1936, mere months after losing their previous bid, Lockheed began their design for what would fit one of the proposals that was to be a 2-engine fighter. The twin boom is now the signature of the P-38, but that wasn't the only idea they had. They looked at a total of 6 different configurations. My favorites are the push-pull idea, which looks like something out of a Jules Verne novel, and the offset cockpit one, because it reminds me of a cloud car or a B-wing. It wouldn't be for another 8 months that the official proposals were sent out in February of 1937. Specifically, Proposal X608 requested a plane that could climb to 20,000 feet in 6 minutes. It would need to reach a top speed of 360 miles an hour at least, and could carry 1,000 pounds of armament. Because of a deal the government had with GM and GE, the plane was required to be powered by 12-cylinder turbo-supercharged Allison V1710s. It was also supposed to be armed by a Hotchkiss 25mm autocannon, which is an anti-aircraft gun or a tank gun. It was never actually made to go in a plane, and there's no reason they should have requested that. On top of all that, extra points would be awarded to any company that used tricycle landing gear instead of the more traditional tail draggers. In what must have been record time, Lockheed submitted their design for their Model 22 just 2 months later on the 13th of April. To be clear, Ben Kelsey built in for there to be 2 contracts awarded. He gave extra points for the landing gear style that Lockheed showed to be proficient at already, and Lockheed had enough foreknowledge to begin their design 8 months ahead of time. I'm not saying Ben Kelsey cheated to help Lockheed because him and Kelly Johnson were friends. I'm saying he might have cheated because he knew that Kelly Johnson was the right man for the job. They became friends later. Also, pretty hilariously, Lockheed's bid for the plane had totally dropped the word interceptor and used the word pursuit again, which means that Congress either wasn't paying attention or just didn't really care about their convictions. So what else is new? Officially, Lockheed claimed that their plane could meet all of their requirements and then some, being able to reach 400 miles per hour, which would make it the first military plane to do so. It would also be the first plane in the US to have butt-jointed, flush-riveted all-metal skin, courtesy of an engineer by the name of James Gershler. It might have also just been the first mass-produced plane to have that, but that was kind of hard to verify. Attached to the bid, Kelly Johnson also included a 6-page report on a little-known phenomenon called compressibility. If you don't know what that is, don't worry, we're going to talk about it in a bit. Lockheed handedly won the contract in June of 1937, and they began to develop their design until July 1938, when they were finally ready to start building the plane now called the XP-38. They elected to build the plane in a secretive facility blocked off from the rest of the company, making the P-38 the first plane developed in what would become known as Lockheed's Skunk Works division. Oversight of the production would shift from Kelly Johnson to Jimmy Gershler, as Johnson would take on a more senior role. Gershler at this point would add inward counter-rotating propellers so they could offset each other's torque. For winning the bid, they were awarded $163,000, which is good because recently they were in $140,000 debt and had only delivered 98 planes since their rebirth. Things were finally starting to look up. The prototype cost $760,000. Right back in the hole! After they put it all together and made sure everything worked, that it was a good design, they immediately disassembled the plane, and on December 31st, 1938, it was smuggled by truck 14 hours overnight as it made a 120-mile trek from Burbank to March Field. From there, it would be reassembled over the next 2 weeks and begin testing. It makes sense in the grand scheme of things why they did that way, but it's small wonder floor guys hate engineers. Well, it wasn't easy. But we built this brand new plane in just under 6 months using those revolutionary techniques you asked for, and all in complete secrecy. It sure did. Looks great. Thanks. I'm taking it apart. What? The plane was rebuilt, it was time to do testing. The first thing Kelsey did was drive it onto the tarmac to do some taxi testing when it immediately failed. The brakes were not strong enough to stop the plane at speed, and they exploded. With no way to stop it, he just drove the plane through a plywood rest building at the end of the tarmac out into the field until it would stop itself. Thankfully, he asked for the more stable tricycle landing gear. Kelsey had the crew put a new wheel on the front that could hold bigger brakes. He had them replace the brake pedal he bent, and also they installed a hand pump that would assist with building up brake pressure, which sounds like a scene out of the Looney Tunes, just like coming in to like land your plane. That's horrifying. And to make it scarier, he had also planned to use the whole plane to slow itself down. The idea was get towards the runway and at the last second, nose the plane up super hard and just use it like its own kite to just stop itself. With the brakes completely and not in any way precariously sorted, he took the plane for its first flight. Alright. And once it was in the air, again, surprise, it nearly immediately failed. 3 out of the 4 aluminum controlling rods controlling the flaps snapped, causing the flaps to flail wildly and buffet the plane to a nearly uncontrollable state anytime the plane was put at a high angle of attack. You know, like his whole plan to land this thing, nose up at the last second, put it at a high angle of attack. But nearly uncontrollable is not the same thing as completely uncontrollable, and Ben Kelsey's out of options, so he sends it. He approaches the runway, and at the last second, presumably as close to the ground as he can, he pulls it up to an over 18-degree angle of attack, so steep that the two tails are dragging on the ground before the wheels. It's through sheer determination and self-confidence Ben Kelsey brings this plane to a stop, ending the maiden voyage of the Model 22 XP-38. When later asked about the details of the precarious landing, he said, quote, "Well, we know it doesn't stall at 18.5 degrees. I have no idea if he was wearing sunglasses. That's just a cool thing to say, and cool guys wear sunglasses. After testing at March Field for a month and patching all the issues, the many issues, it was decided that it should be moved to Wright Field in Dayton, Ohio, and continue testing there. Since they were going to Dayton, Ben Kelsey suggested that they try a speed dash and try and really test the plane. Newly commissioned director of the Army Air Corps, General Hap Arnold, suggested that since Dayton's, pretty close to New York, why don't we try and make a mad dash for New York and see if we can set the record that's currently held by, Howard Hughes? Yeah, flyboy business magnate Howard Hughes holding the record, and they're just gonna, if we have time, we'll see, we'll jump up there. The plan was literally, let's fly to Dayton, see how we're doing on time, and if we think we're good, we'll just, jump up to New York and set a record that someone has spent millions of dollars, probably millions of dollars trying to set. Officially, this wouldn't count as a record because the plane couldn't make it to Wright Field in one tank, but it was required to go to Wright Field, so it had to make one stop, fill up, go to Wright Field, check the time, and then if it looked good, go to New York. So they would have to land and take off twice, whereas Hughes, not being required to go to Wright Field, had the ability to stop wherever he wanted, and so he only had to stop once. But they were just going to compare air times, and that'd be good enough to sell headlines, and that's all anyone really cares about anyway. So Kelsey flew generally conservatively for his first 2 legs, but when he landed in Ohio, it was decided that they were doing great on time, so Hap told him to fly to New York and to not spare the horses. As he flew past the tower in Columbus, Ohio, he gave his altitude of 20,000 feet going 380 miles per hour, and they were like, "Say again?" That can't be right. Check your instruments. To which he confirmed, and they still didn't believe him. This went back and forth a few times until by the time they finally did believe him, he was out of radio reach. Top speed on that flight was officially 420 miles an hour. Nice. When he was really giving it the beans. On approach to New York, he realized that they had made a slight error in this plan. In all their hurry to get there, they had forgot to tell anyone that they were coming. So the airport didn't have a spot for them to land. They quickly scrambled and tried to give them a spot to land, and while that was happening, Kelsey took to a holding maneuver. But the thing is, the brakes still hadn't been completely solved, so he took to slowing the plane as much as he could while he was in this holding maneuver. When they finally gave him the go-ahead, he began his descent. As he approached, he attempted to throttle on the engines to level out the plane, and the engines refused to spin up. So he throttled on even harder, still nothing. He said later that if he had realized that the engines weren't going to ever fire on, he could have at that moment just turned into a field and bellied down with like an emergency landing, no harm done. But by the time he realized that, it was too late and the plane was already clipping treetops. When he finally set the plane down, he had fallen short of the airport and landed in the Coldstream Golf Course, apparently directly into a sand trap, which in the pictures, it doesn't really look like it, but I believe it because if you've ever played golf, then you know those things are magnets for all airborne objects. The cause of the crash was decided to be something called carburetor icing. So to describe that, I'm also going to describe how a carburetor works real quick. So first, your engine pulls in air. It pulls in air from the atmosphere into your carburetor, and then your carburetor next down into this section that's called the venturi. The engine wants a certain amount of air to come in, so in order to get that amount of air through the now smaller cross-sectional area that is the venturi, the airflow has to speed up. And once the airflow speeds up, the pressure drops, which pulls in fuel from your bowl into your carburetor, and then the fuel and air mix, and then it flows past your throttle valve here, a butterfly valve. Then it flows into the engine mixed, and then your engine compresses it, ignites it, and then you get power. Carburetor icing can happen when your plane is throttled down for long periods of time. You know, like if you forgot to call ahead and they make you take a holding pattern, and then you are also trying to slow down your plane because you don't want to try and land it and then have to crash through another rest area. That might cause it. What happens at a low throttle setting is, starting with the venturi, you have that low pressure, and the low pressure causes a temperature drop, but then in your throttled section, you have these portions, just a small area where the air can flow through. And that also causes a choked point where the air is actually flowing at sonic speeds, at the speed of sound, and that's really fast, and it has a big pressure drop, which also is accompanied by a big temperature drop. These two together cause the air to begin cooling, which then cools the sides of the carburetor. So on top of that, you have the fuel mixing in with the air, and as the fuel mixes in with the air, it wants to evaporate from its liquid state into its gaseous state. In order to do that, it's going to need a certain amount of energy that it's going to borrow from the air. So in order to convert your fuel into your gaseous state, you have to cool the air even more. And as the air begins to cool, especially in portions of high humidity, that humidity will begin to condensate out of the air and sit on the walls of the carburetor. But that carburetor we just cooled down with the airflow through, and then along with the cooling of the air with the gas evaporating into its gaseous state, the fuel evaporating into its gaseous state, we've now cooled the carburetor even more to the point where that condensation will begin to freeze on the walls of the carburetor. It'll begin to freeze over the tighter sections, so you'll have less airflow, which will first actually induce a even more rich situation. It also freezes over your jet where you're supposed to get fuel from your bowl. So you now got constricted fuel flow and airflow, which limits power to the engines, and you've now somehow invented a more dangerous version of lawn darts. Anyway, back to the freshly crashed XP-38. Climbing out of the plane, he got himself to the first phone he could find and called General Hap Arnold to inform him that despite not having any guns, he did manage to hit a bogey with that very expensive one-of-one prototype plane that he convinced the army to buy. Much to Kelsey's relief, I'm sure Arnold wasn't mad in the slightest. In fact, after checking on Kelsey to make sure that he was okay, he ordered him down to Washington as soon as he could. And within 48 hours, they were going around to every congressperson and government official they could that would listen about their new 400-mile-per-hour fighter that had just broken the Hughes record. Never mind that Kelsey had completely binned it. And if you only count the airtime, he did beat the Hughes record by a full 20 minutes. And that includes extra time he had to commit for taking off and landing. Now, you might expect that crashing your plane after just 1 month of testing would set the whole program back. But according to Kelsey, showing what the plane can do and then promptly having no other choice but to get a new one really helped to speed things up. Within 2 months, the Army had ordered 13 new prototypes for a grand total of $2.1 million. These would be the YP-38s, also known as the Yippies for short. Some design updates for the YP-38: their propellers went from inward spinning to outward spinning, which fixed some buffeting issues that they had with the XP-38, and then they also got more settled in their armaments. They decided to use a 15-round Browning M9 37mm autocannon instead of the non-existent Hotchkiss 25mm, as well as two 50 calibers and two 30 caliber machine guns. In case you only speak in moon landing units and you're wondering what size a 37mm round is, it's about 1.5 inches in diameter and about 6 inches long. At the same time Lockheed was building the Yippies, they're also growing a lot from commercial contracts and a bomber by the name of the Ventura that they were selling to the Allies. So their notoriety grew, and the Allied Purchasing Commission invited them to a meeting in New York. For the Model 22, the XP-38, YP-38, they decided to send Jimmy Gershler. News of this 400-mile-per-hour fighter had spread, and the representatives needed to know more and were pretty much just ready to buy. The only problem was that they already had an order in for the Curtiss P-40 Thunderhawk, Warhawk, Kitty Hawk, whatever you want to call it, Hawk, and those use the same Allison V1710 engines that the P-38 does. So in order to simplify supply lines and maintenance, they wanted the engines to be the exact same. That means they couldn't spin two different ways. They had to all spin one way, which is annoying. But then also the P-40 didn't have turbos. So they wanted the P-38, the 400-mile-per-hour plane with no turbos. It's so frustrating when you have spent so much time designing something. You build this great thing, exactly what someone wants and they need, and they come in and look at it and go, yes, but make it wrong instead. Let's just say I can relate to how Jimmy Gershler must have been feeling at this moment. And for extra context, at this point, Jimmy Gershler had been removed from the project because all of the stress had driven him to a drinking problem that would eventually end his career, and that's very sad and it's very unfortunate, but that's a different story. Right now, I can only imagine he perforated an ulcer. Or he would have if it weren't for the fact that this request was also for 667 new fighters that they were going to pay $100 million for. So, crisis averted, I'm sure he could figure it out. The special planes that they were going to request were going to be the 322B for Britain and the 322F for France. And I'm sure Lockheed was going to get right on building those planes, but the thing about a $100 million order is, it doesn't matter how much money you get, you need someone to build it. And Lockheed was still in very deep growing pains. At this point, they were hiring up to 500 people a day. Or if it's like a standard 8-hour day, that's about one person a minute. It's no wonder our grandparents and parents thought we could just go out and hit the streets with the resume and find a job. They were getting careers based on the color of their shoes and the preferred type of bubblegum. Anyway, all this growth slowed production way down, and the first YP-38 didn't end up rolling off production until September of 1940. To say nothing of the 322s, which hadn't even made it to production at all. And if you're a nerd, you might know that France fell in June of 1940. So the whole order now just fell to a probably very cash-strapped Britain. But that's Britain's problem, not Lockheed's. Lockheed had their own problems to worry about. Like in the following May, when during a routine test flight, Major Signa Gilkey found a problem with the P-38 that would plague it for the rest of its life. Starting from some unspecified altitude, he put the plane into a power dive. The twin Allison V-12s accelerated the plane, rapidly dragging it up past 400 miles an hour. The Yippie began to violently shake and toss the pilot around like a clownfish in a dentist's office.
Fishy! Wake up! Wake up!
At the same time, the plane began to tuck under and pitched itself into an outside roll, which is to say like this way. For a brief moment that must have felt like forever, the controls were completely locked. It wasn't until his altitude had dropped to about 7,000 feet that he was able to regain control and slowly work himself out of the dive. The after-action report focused mainly on the buffeting, but it was clear that power dives were to be approached with caution from this point forward. With news of this, Britain began making changes to and eventually tried to get themselves out of their contract, citing this issue as the reason. Really, that's because they were probably a little light in the pockets, but that's neither here nor there. A list of fixes were tested as solutions for this problem, like for example adding external counterbalances to the elevator, as some people thought it was unstable. They did nothing to fix the problem, but the Army insisted that they stay throughout the life of the plane, much to the chagrin of Johnson, who said of them, "They never did anything except kill a few pilots who had to bail out." Johnson and Lockheed had tried to get access to NACA's wind tunnels for large-scale model and high-speed testing, but NACA had some issues of their own. Also, they had heard about all the buffeting issues with Lockheed's plane, and they were worried that if they put that in their wind tunnel, it would damage their wind tunnel, so they just denied them outright. Instead, Lockheed would have to subject the plane to a testing regiment that would put it into steeper and steeper dives, trying to avoid getting into that tricky area where there was the buffeting and the control lockup, but while also still getting to know more about the plane. This testing regiment would continue until November 4th, 1941. Test pilot Ralph Virden had had a long career as a pilot spanning back to the mid-1920s, as both a mail carrier and an airline pilot. With over 15,000 hours of flight experience, he had built a reputation of always playing it smart, being safe, and had reportedly never had to bail on a plane. So on November 3rd, when the Lockheed engineers came to Virden and the other test pilots, asking them to take the plane into a much steeper dive to test a new spring tab that could hopefully fix the control lockup that they were dealing with, it was maybe a little bit weird when Virden was the only one who accepted the challenge. Maybe a little weird, but also, if there was one man who could do it, it would have been Virden. The other test pilots said they tried to bargain with him all night to get him to back out, but Virden's mind was made up. So the next day, after his normal regimen of tests, he took the plane up to a high altitude, pitched it over, and put it into a power dive. Plane tucked under just like Gilkey had said it would, but unfortunately for Virden, he would not be exiting this dive. An observer said he watched as Virden's plane began to pull out of the dive, but as the plane tilted up, the tail assembly disconnected and simply floated away, leaving the pilot stranded as the plane entered into a flat spin. The horrible sight was met with an equally horrible sound that could be heard at the Lockheed offices and attracted the attention of the whole airfield. Onlookers watched as the first Yippee off the production line, serial number 39-689, flipped over and plunged cockpit first into the house at 1147 Elm Street in Glendale, killing Virden immediately. And if there's any relief to be had in that moment, it's that while the occupant of that house was home, he was not only found to be alive, but he, Jack Rip Van Winkle Jensen, was still asleep. I've heard people say they're such heavy sleepers you can drive a freight train through their bedroom, but never heard anyone say you could crash a plane into their kitchen. The other bit of good news is that at least Virden's death wouldn't be totally in vain, as NACA was now being forced to let Lockheed in at the behest of General Arnold. Within a month, they had a 1/6 scale model in the 8-foot wind tunnel and were finally able to begin sorting out the problem. They tried all sorts of things, ranging from elongating the fuselage, putting a glove that sat on the leading edge and the trailing edge of the wing to change the wing profile, changing position of the gondola or fuselage, the center fuselage is what they call the gondola, height-wise within the wing profile, and also they tried adding fillets to the leading edge of where the wing profile meets the gondola. What they quickly found was something that Kelly Johnson had suspected all along. The buffeting and the diving issues were separate issues, although they were both caused by compressibility. See, I told you we'd talk about it again. Compressibility is basically what it says on the tin. It's a measure of how a fluid or solid changes volume with changes in pressure, which is to say how easy it is to compress or expand something. In this case, air. So say you have a plane flying through the air. It's going to start pushing the air in all sorts of directions, mostly hopefully over the wings in a nice orderly fashion, but it's going to push the air all sorts of directions. As the plane starts getting faster, the air actually can't get out of the way fast enough, and it begins to compress before flowing over those surfaces. In the P-38, this happened in two ways. Let's talk about the buffeting issue first. As the air would flow over the gondola into the wing section and off of the propellers and just generally into the wing section, it was found that it would all pile up kind of in the corner here where the wing sections meet the gondola. And then it would expand, and then while it was expanding, it would accelerate to Mach 1 or near Mach 1 to a point where it created a lot of turbulence coming off the back. And that turbulence would hit the tail section and buffet the tail, causing the whole plane to shake, felt in the high-speed dives. I realized while I was editing that I forgot to mention that those buffeting issues that I was just telling you about were solved by the fillets added to the gondola section that I had mentioned earlier. So instead of all of the air piling up there, like I was saying, it instead has a nice smooth, round surface that it can just flow over. So I just wanted to cut in and say that. Also, every Reddit post about how to start a YouTube channel says that I'm supposed to tell you to like and subscribe. So, and we're about 28 minutes in, so I assume if you've made it this far that you at least kind of like it, so you can do that. And if you don't and you just disagree with me, then you can comment what you disagree about and I will fight you. Anyway, back to the video. The diving problem is a bit more complicated. This is the first time humans experience a phenomenon known as Mach tuck. To explain Mach tuck, it's going to be useful to explain how lift works. And to explain how lift works, there's two things to know. One, according to NASA, the real details of how an object generates lift are very complex and do not lend themselves to simplification. I'm going to do it anyway. And two, you may have heard an explanation known as the equal transit theory. And it's basically where they tell you that you have the airstream coming and there's like a block of air and the air goes over the top and the bottom and it wants to reach the back at the same time. And since the air going over the top has a longer distance to travel, you end up with a higher speed over the top, which creates a lower pressure, and then that generates lift. There's a lot of reasons why that doesn't make any sense, but the first thing to note is that there's nothing in physics that says that the air that starts at the front has to meet up at the back at the exact same time. It's not like they're like two air molecules going along and then, "Oi bruv, this is messed up, but let's meet up at the trailing edge pub for a pint afterwards, yeah?" No, they're molecules, they don't have brains, therefore they have very little use for alcohol and are horrible at keeping a schedule. The accent is correct though. So how does lift really work? First of all, at subsonic speeds, lift is dependent on the coefficient of lift of the specific object, the surface area of the object, the speed of the object, and the angle of attack. Those last three are pretty intuitive. If you remember when you're a kid, when you're driving along, you stick your hand out the window. If you point your hand up more, it'll lift up. If you point it down into the wind, it'll drop down. That's your angle of attack. If the car's going faster, your hand will move faster. And then it's kind of hard to make your hand bigger, but you kind of know from dragging bigger and bigger, maybe bed sheets or something when you're a kid, or an umbrella, that if you make it bigger, it has more force on it. That's more surface area, more area for the air to act on. The coefficient of lift is a little more of an amoeba. That can be mathematically found for certain profiles, but for most wing profiles, it's just found by testing and then using that testing data to give us a coefficient of lift. In any case, that can just be viewed as the propensity of a shape to generate lift. How this all comes together is pretty straightforward. Say you have a wing in a flow stream like this. The first mechanic to really look at is the air that goes under the bottom. As the air flies into the wing, it's redirected downward, especially at a higher angle of attack, you'll get directed more downward. To quote the second most famous virgin of all time, third if you're Catholic, for every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. So if we're pushing our air downward, coming from up here to down here, or a more aggressive angle, then that's going to push our wing back up. The air flowing over the top of the wing is a little more complicated. As your wing moves forward with your plane moving forward, it creates a low pressure zone behind the wing and then a high pressure zone in front of the wing. The pressure difference between these two areas causes the air to accelerate over the wing. From there, something called the Coanda effect takes over. The Coanda effect is what happens when you're dissociating in the shower and then you lift your arm and you start to water bend. That is the Coanda effect. It happens with air on a wing form just like it happens with water down your arm. The air sticks to the wing form, creating what we call a boundary layer, and then the air gets pushed downward just like before. Air getting pushed downward means we're pushing our wing up. Every action there's an equal and opposite reaction. That's basically how lift works. I don't understand why this isn't actually taught. It's not that hard to understand, especially just conceptually. We don't have to really do any math, and they don't have to make up some stupid thing about how some molecules are going off for a pint. It doesn't make any sense. Now, Mach tuck is caused by the migration of the center of pressure aftward on the plane. And what that means is that the average aerodynamic forces on the wing or on the plane moves towards the tail, pushing up further back on the plane, which ends up causing the plane to go into a nosedive. This specifically happens in the wings. When a plane is flying at lower speeds, the forces of lift that I was describing earlier average out to acting like a single force, pushing up about a fourth the way down the core of the wing, so about there. As the plane speeds up, it moves into what we call the transonic region, where the acceleration of the air around the plane generates flows that are both greater than and less than the speed of sound. The transonic region is different for each plane, but it begins when the plane reaches its critical Mach number, which is to say the point where the plane generates flows of at least Mach 1, the speed of sound. When that sonic flow going over the wing decelerates again to a subsonic speed, it creates what's called a normal shock, which acts basically like a singularity, where the air behind the shock rapidly slows down and then the pressure and temperature rise. Since we have high pressure behind the wave, we lose some lift at the trailing edge, but the air before the shock is supersonic and has a very low pressure. Let's say that's our supersonic flow inside that bubble. It really does look like kind of a bubble of an area where you have supersonic flow. And within that area of the supersonic flow, you have very low pressure, which causes a lot of lift on the front end of the wing. But what happens is as our plane gets faster and faster, this normal shock actually stops happening here and moves further back on the wing to where we have this now, our bubble moves further back and we have a much larger area of very low pressure. What happens when we have that much larger area of very low pressure is the average force, the center of pressure, like I said before, moves further back. So instead of being at a fourth of the way back on the wing, it now moves to about halfway back on the wing. Now that's only part of the problem that's happening, because the immediate jump in pressure behind the shock can also cause the air to separate from the boundary layer. So instead of having this nice smooth flow coming off the back end, instead it'll have something that looks like this. It'll be kind of turbulent flow all back through here. That turbulent flow doesn't do that downward trajectory, doesn't create lift like we want it to, but also it moves towards the tail. And the tail is our elevator, which would normally correct our dive tendencies. But if the tail is receiving all this turbulent air, it can't redirect turbulent air like it can redirect clean air. Turbulent air flows in all sorts of different directions, which causes a bunch of different forces happening on the tail, which can cause it to freeze or control itself, which is what the pilots complained about on the P-38. And even if they were able to gain control again, they wouldn't be very helpful since the turbulent air just kind of swirled around a bunch of different directions as it came off of the tail, and it didn't go any one direction, which means we don't have control, right? We're not directing the airflow in one direction. It might be going forward, it might be going up, might be going down. So our equal and opposite reactions is all over the place, and it basically nulls out to zero. For a P-38, this effect happened when the plane was moving around Mach 0.68. At sea level, that would be 520 miles per hour. However, the speed of sound in a gas is dependent on the density and temperature of the gas, which makes sense. If the speed of sound is how quickly a wave can travel through the gas, the higher density means more molecules in a given space to interact with each other, and the higher temperature means those molecules are moving faster. This will lead to a quicker interaction between those molecules and thus faster motion in the waves. So if you were to drop the density and temperature of the air around you, like say fly up to 15,000 feet, the speed of sound decreases and suddenly Mach 0.68 becomes about 420 miles per hour. Or, just slightly faster than the P-38 was able to do in level flight, which is exactly why they had to initially limit the P-38 in high altitude dives. It was very easy to accelerate the plane up past that speed with the assistance of gravity. Solving this issue of Mach tuck was a long process, and while the testing was just getting started, the attack on Pearl Harbor ripped the US into the very war the P-38 was designed for. Britain got their wish, they got out of the contract, but didn't really get out so much as Uncle Sam came along and said, "I'll be taking that, thank you muchly," and they took all the P-38s. Only 2 P-38s were ever actually painted in British colors. At this point, by the time they had made it to production, the armaments had also changed once more, to using 4 50 caliber machine guns now and a 20mm cannon. And if you're one of those must stop in power guys, the total ammunition for the cannon went from 15 to 150. And according to one pilot, the first time he shot a Japanese Zero with the cannon, he, quote, blew him off the map. Just removed him from existence. Avada Kedavra. Also, the 20mm cannon was made by Oldsmobile, which in my mind bumps off the 442 as the coolest thing they've ever made. Pretty much immediately the P-38 was being put into action. They began moving squadrons both to the Aleutian Islands to fend off the Japanese and to England to act as a forward base of operations for all the theaters over there. Initially, they wanted to ship them and basically every other plane to England by boat, but it became apparent that they could run into German U-boats and they would sink the boats, and that would not be very good for getting planes to England. When asked about this problem at a dinner, Hap Arnold casually said, "We'll fly them there." And they were like, "Really? You really think we can do that?" To which he was like, See, there was a slight issue with this. Remember when I said they had banned all external fuel tanks? Well, while the bombers would have no problem jumping from Canada to Iceland then to Britain, There's no way the fighters would be able to fly that far. No way, except for the fact that Ben Kelsey, once again, doesn't really care about the rules and does whatever he wants because he knows it's right. Pretty much as soon as the plane had proved it could do what Kelsey wanted it to do, he had Lockheed set up a range extension program. This range extension program was just another cover he used so people wouldn't look beneath the surface. It proved that with twin 165-gallon drop tanks, the plane could fly 2,200 miles, which would be more than enough to get them to England. So when Hap approached Kelsey with this new foot and mouth problem that he'd gotten himself into, the conversation went something like this.
Kelsey, what can we do to get P-38s enough range to get to England?
Huh? Oh, yeah, I already solved that.
You did? How?
Drop tanks, they'll do 2 Gs plus if you treat her nicely.
And who in the blue blazes authorized that?
Nobody. So since they had a bunch of planes already made, they had to cycle them back through production and then began shipping them to England as soon as they could be equipped with drop tanks. By May of 1942, the first planes were headed out, given bombers for each group as a navigator. It was during these initial forces buildup that the P-38 got their first victories. The first was in the Aleutian Islands on August 4th of 1942. Lieutenants Kenneth Ambrose and Stanley Long were flying wing for a B-17 while on patrol, and the B-17 radioed over about 2 specks they saw out in the distance. At first, the P-38s didn't see them, but that problem was soon rectified as quickly 2 Kawasaki H-6K4 Type 97, nicknamed the Mavises by the Allies, flying boats came into view as they were on their way to bomb the naval installations at Dutch Harbor. The 2 pilots took 1 plane each and began firing a volley of rounds. Ambrose missed entirely on his first pass, but the 2 flying boats ended up grouping together, and Long was able to land hits on both of them before the P-38s went screaming past these encroaching enemies. The Mavises tried to drop altitude and get to cloud cover, but the nimble P-38s were able to turn around and take another pass before they could get away. This time, both men were accurate as the Mavises were sent burning to the deck, scoring the first 2 victories for the P-38. Just 10 days later in Iceland, Captain John Weltman and his wingman Elza Scheher intercepted a Focke-Wulf FW-200 Condor. A P-40 piloted by Lieutenant Joseph Schaefer had been pursuing the Nazi recon bomber, but had to peel off. Weltman and Scheher engaged and landed a barrage of shots, but Weltman had to fall out when his plane started acting up. He told Scheher to stay on the enemy until he could return with a new plane from base, but after a few minutes, Scheher decided that the Krauts might get away, so he went in and engaged on the now smoking Focke-Wulf. Before he could open fire, the plane exploded and Scheher was forced to dodge debris. Credit for this went to Schaefer and Scheher, but it seems more reasonable to give some credit to Weltman at least, if not, give him the other 50%. In any case, this marked the first victory for a US plane over the Germans. You would think, given these 2 early victories specifically over bombers, the US would consider using P-38s as long-range fighters to deal with incoming enemy bombers and to run defense for bombers, but that wouldn't come until much later. In the meantime, they did have another mission for the P-38. Due to its turbochargers, its exhaust was comparatively pretty quiet, and with its double tails and extra wide elevator, it was a very stable plane. Even before the war, the US had ordered some P-38s to be equipped with cameras instead of guns. This may have contributed to why some people might have turned a blind eye to Kelsey's whole range extension program, like, I can't take pictures of people if I can't get to the enemy, so you gotta give me more range. That and the fact that he never actually put the program in writing and just personally asked Lockheed to do it.
Frankly, my dear, I don't give a damn.
Anyway, these initial retrofits were called F4s, but they were quickly replaced by the factory-built recon plane called the F5s. Throughout the war, the P-38 gathered at least 90% of all film over Europe for the Americans. As America's involvement in the war ramped up, the P-38 was introduced to each and every new theater and area of operation that the US participated in. Thanks to their drop tanks, they were able to be flown almost directly into the North African theater from England. First, they had to fly such a low altitude along the French coast that the German artillery couldn't aim at them, and then they would go around Portugal and Spain, and if anyone ran out of fuel, they could stop at Gibraltar or otherwise just go directly to Africa. There's a story of one pilot who actually ran out of fuel before he made it to Gibraltar and had to land in Spain. While he was in Spain, he was captured by men on horses who were waiting for him on the tarmac. They took him prisoner where he had to wait with like other pilots and German pilots who had also gotten captured. And then an engineer came to him and asked the pilot to show him how to like operate the plane so that they could move the plane from where it was to where it needed to go. And they also had to refuel it when they did this, and while he was showing the engineer what to do, another plane came in, landed, and all of the guards had to go greet that plane, so they left. And the pilot was just like, and he just turned the plane on, and much to the detest of the engineer who was waving him to shut it down, he just ramped up the engine and blew the engineer off the wing, drove this plane across the tarmac, didn't stop to go down the line of the tarmac, instead driving across the field and taking off out of a field. Once again, thanks Ben Kelsey for the tricycle landing gear. While in Africa, they finally received their famous nickname, Lightning, from the British. This name stuck so well it beat out Lockheed's intended name for it, the Atalanta. But cool nicknames aside, the African/Mediterranean theater proved to be largely a hit to the reputation of the P-38s. See, in the early days of the US's involvement, there was a lack of good piloting training, especially for twin-engine fighters. When they first entered service, the P-38 was only a single-seat plane, which meant that trainees had to just sit in the cockpit for hours to familiarize themselves with it, get a little bit of training in a much slower and calmer twin-engine plane, and then just be sent up in the air to figure out how to fly the most advanced fighter in the world at the time. This actually led to a large portion of the losses of the P-38 in the early days. One particularly dangerous situation was if an engine went out on takeoff. Traditional wisdom would have the pilot power on the leftover engine, but the P-38 had such powerful engines that it would cause the plane to roll into the dead engine and crash. Instead, a pilot had to reduce power in that leftover engine, feather the propellers on the dead engine, and then slowly power on the live engine until the plane could reach level flight, at which point they would then land again and have to get into a new plane or just be scrapped from the mission entirely. This lack of specific training would later be solved by having prospective pilots ride in the back of specially modified training planes called piggybacks that could narrowly fit a passenger behind the pilot, but that wouldn't be for another year or so. Now, tie that in with the fact that while the Army Air Force, the new name for the Army Air Corps, had been forced to see the need for escort planes for bombers, they still required the P-38s to fly in close formation with the bombers, which made them easy pickings for the Axis planes, especially in a dive attack. These two things, training deficits and poor tactics, more than anything led to unacceptably high casualty rates for the P-38s. But that didn't matter. Bad gas travels fast, and pilots, civilians, and higher-ups alike were questioning the validity of the plane. If it was having diving issues in testing, then obviously those must be the problem of it in theater. It couldn't be that, I don't know, we don't know how to fly this plane, or maybe we're not very good at modern warfare yet. Nope, the plane had become known as the plane with the compressibility issues, which is a far cry from the plane that had previously saw 87% of new pilots begging to fly it. And if you're still confused about those compressibility issues are, and if I didn't explain it well enough, then don't feel bad, you're not alone. In fact, most of my research for this was trying to understand it myself, and even the compressible fluid dynamics and aerodynamics textbooks I read only gave Mach Tuck like 1 or 2 paragraphs. It's just not a really talked about subject. As for the pilots themselves, according to one pilot, when they were told they'd be flying the P-38s, they would all begin groaning and lamenting the compressibility issues of the plane, and then just sort of look around and hope that everyone else agreed, because nobody knew what they were talking about. Also, speaking of bad gas, that was an issue back in the European theater. Literally, the UK processed their petroleum products differently, specifically using more aromatics than we did, and the P-38s were pretty particular to American gas. This especially became an issue in long-range missions at cruising speed. Conventional thought at the time was to have the plane fly at a high RPM with a low manifold pressure, which would force it into a rich fuel mixture. Like I said before, a fuel evaporation cools the mixture, and that carries into your combustion chamber, and it will keep the engine cool. And while the P-38 did have issues with overheating, that would be solved by increasing the intercooler size, moving it from the wing leading edge, and giving its own duct. These throttle settings weren't a very good solution. Also, it's not a overheating issue in that it was a bad design. It's that by now, Allison was able to squeeze an extra 425 horsepower out of each engine. So that leading edge cooling that they had before was perfectly fine for the 1,000 horsepower Allison engines, but the 1,425 horsepower engines required more cooling. However, what these conditions did do was cause the lead in the fuel, a stabilizing agent, to separate out from the fuel while it was in the manifold. This meant that the mixture would pre-ignite in the combustion chamber and damage the engine, often in a very bad way. And because these issues mostly popped up in long-range missions, and those were also the missions where the planes had to fly at a very high altitude, some people thought that this issue was caused by that high altitude, a reputation that would stick with that plane up until to this day. There's also an issue of faulty spark plugs, but that seems to me that would mostly cause misfires, and while those can cause damage, it's not really that big of an issue by comparison, In any case, the detonation was mostly a problem in England, which means the spark plugs that were shipped worldwide weren't likely the issue. These issues had to wait though, as Lockheed was still focused on that diving issue. The problem would last until 1943, when a relatively small set of dive flaps placed outside the nacelles were proven effective at releasing the Lightning from the clutches of compressibility. The dive flaps worked in two ways. First, they were positioned underneath the wing at about a third the way back on the cord, coming down like maybe about a 45-degree angle. And what they did was they caused the flow that was going under the wing, instead of to extend like this, it acted more, it would flow kind of down earlier, so we get that downward push earlier. And what all that did was, since we were pushing down on the air earlier, we were pushing up on the wing earlier, which moved our center of pressure back from here back up to about closer to the quarter that we had before. This probably looked more like it is kind of hinged, and then this kind of looked probably more like this, but the idea still holds. The other thing the dive flaps did was, because all that air going underneath was being redirected earlier, all the air up front was having a harder time expanding. Because remember, this issue comes from the compressibility of the air. The air compresses at the front and then expands over the wing, right? So we're stopping the expansion of the air over the wing. It's pretty nebulous, but it's like creating thicker air all around your wing. Because it can't expand that way, it has to work harder to expand going over the top. What this means is that the air was slower to accelerate over the top, right? Because it can't expand as easily. But also, since the air was a higher density under that higher pressure, the speed of sound is higher, right? Speed of sound is dependent on our density. Since the speed of sound is higher, that means our flow needs to go faster to reach that speed of sound and create our little burble here, and then also to create our singularity, our Mach wave. This had the effect of delaying or even completely preventing our flow from reaching the speed of sound, which would reduce or completely eliminate our shock wave. So it would look more like this. So what happens now is our shock wave happens further back on the wing. And since our field wasn't in as much of the sonic flow range, we'd have a smaller shock wave. So it would have a much lesser effect on the flow after the shock wave, so that we would have lesser or even maybe no turbulence coming off the back of the wing. That allowed the elevators to work again and be able to pull the plane out of the dive. This is a much easier version than the original solution, which is just wait till the plane gets down to about 7,000 feet where the air thickens up, and then it does the exact same thing. We get a slower flow over the top, we get a lesser shock wave if we have any shock wave, and we get less turbulence, right? This kind of simulates creating that lower elevation air density just by forcing that air to not be able to expand over the bottom, keeping the air compressed at the front or at a higher pressure as it goes over the wing. Compressible aerodynamics is a pretty difficult concept to grasp, but the brass tacks is that we're no longer being rotated into the dive, right? Because the air pushing down earlier moves our center of pressure back forward. And then also, the higher pressure going over the wing keeps our shock wave and our turbulence down, which means that our stabilizers are able to actually affect the flow, which means we're not only not being rotated actively into a dive, but we're actually able to control whatever dive we're in. That is, as long as the flaps were deployed before the plane entered the transonic region. With the final word of approval, Ben Kelsey decided to try and deploy the flaps after the plane was in the dive. To make a long story short, the motors that extended the flaps weren't strong enough to overcome the aerodynamic forces, and he ended up having to roll the plane over from in the dive and then jump and push himself out of the plane. He barely escaped with just a broken ankle, but the plane was completely scrapped. Afterwards, he said he had planned on removing the flaps all along, but he just kind of wanted to see what happened, dude. Now, never mind the fact that he risked his life and scrapped a perfectly good $100,000 airplane. Who invented the flaps is a bit contentious. Some people attribute it to Kelly Johnson and his team. Others attribute it to an engineer by the name of John Stack at NACA. It probably was John Stack in conjunction with the Lockheed team. But regardless of who came up with the idea, they worked, and Lockheed began implementing them immediately. You can see both the fillets that were needed and the dive flaps. Oh, it's very cool. Planes already in service were sent retrofit kits, and then they were installed on every new plane coming off the line. There was one hiccup though in rolling these out, when a very zealous but not terribly studious RAF pilot mistook a Douglas C-54 for a Focke-Wulf FW200 and shot it down while it was carrying about 200 kits. Anyway, Gomer Piles aside, Lockheed was now free to begin fixing those other issues as well as testing new ideas. Piggybacks became standard that same year, the intercoolers removed from the wings like I had said before, and the issue of ill-advised throttle control became better advised when Lockheed sent test pilot Tony Levere to Europe to begin raising morale in early 1944. Well, specifically there to show that the plane was indeed capable in a dogfight, which he did by regularly outperforming other pilots in P-47s, he also proved that by lowering the RPM and increasing the manifold pressure, you could not only reduce the number of engine failures, but you could increase the range of the planes. Charles Lindbergh gave the same advice in the Pacific, but that was just for the range issues, because they weren't having the same failures, because they were using American gas. The P-38s also started to get rejetted for use with this more aromatic fuel in the event that pilots didn't follow instructions. You know, something about horses refusing to hydrate and whatnot. During this time, they also investigated many different use cases and armaments for the Lightning. Some worked, some didn't. Some might have worked if they were given more resources and time. Some examples of use cases that worked were dive and skip bombing boats, as well as strategic bombing of targets. Dive and skip bombing can be done with the stock standard P-38, but the strategic bombing saw one of the more prolific modifications of the P-38 known as the droop snoot. Invented by Colonels Cass Hugh and Don Ashender, the droop snoot was essentially a P-38 with the guns replaced by a bombing window for a second passenger that could sight and operate bombs. Only one droop snoot was required per squadron, as they could signal to the rest of the planes when to drop their bombs, which meant that aside from their fearless gunless leader, after dropping their bombs, the rest of the P-38s could fight their way out if they needed to. The same thing was accomplished for night bombing using the Pathfinder, which had a radar instead of a bomb window. Some ideas that didn't work were the time that they strapped 12 rocket launchers to the wings of this thing. Not rockets, they did that and it did work later, but rocket launchers, like legitimate HFARs. Just let's throw some bazookas at this bad boy and see how she rips. Some of these actually made it to combat, but predictably she did not rip great. There was also an idea put forward by the Army to have sort of a snub-nose plane, which would have all of the guns replaced by a single 75mm cannon.
3, 2, 1.
That idea was so ridiculous it didn't make it to Kelly Johnson until about 30 years after the fact, and he was kind of upset when he heard about it. Some ideas that might have worked if they were needed more badly or if they had more time and resources were the float plane version that was for trans-Pacific transportation and the time they tried to use it to launch torpedoes. The torpedoes actually did drop, it just wasn't really necessary. Also, a special mention of the time they put a second 20mm in the nose. I didn't really know where to put this, because they didn't use it, but it's not because it didn't work, or they needed more time to make it work. Actually, it worked really well. It was just completely unnecessary. Still, the program survived for like 3 years, presumably while they were just waiting for someone to give them a reason.
Go ahead. Make my day.
They basically threw every idea at this thing, and it seemingly always had room. It could carry 4,000 pounds of bombs, drop tanks, and or rockets on top of its guns and see only a 6% reduction in top speed, which nearly makes it classify as a medium bomber. Whatever they were going to throw at it, short of a whole other vehicle, wasn't going to be a problem. Whatever the armament, whatever the mission, the P-38 showed up and did its job. In the words of Ben Kelsey, that comfortable old cluck would fly like hell, fight like a wasp upstairs, and land like a butterfly. Speaking of fighting like a wasp, it'd be too long to list every spectacular fight the P-38 was involved in, so I'll stick with the brass tacks of its service history. The Lightning accounted for over 6,400 air-to-air combat kills, making it the highest of any US fighter in World War II. 2,500 of those victories were in Europe, where the plane supposedly couldn't perform. More on that later. It was a major form of air support on D-Day, acting as a fighter bomber, where it would do dive bombing raids to destroy radars, troop emplacements, flak towers, and whatever armor the enemy had, while also fending off any air support the Axis tried to launch. Moving over to the Pacific, it scored 1,800 victories. This is also the turf of the two aces I mentioned at the beginning of the video. Richard Bong had 40 kills and Thomas McGuire had 38, which means that these two men accounted for 4.3% of the kills by P-38s in that theater. And that might not sound like a lot, but they themselves only accounted for 0.15% of P-38 pilots in that theater, which means they were heavily overrepresented in the stat sheet. Also, Richard Bong got a confirmed alligator kill when he shot one as it was swimming towards his downed wingman, which means he's also overrepresented in the killed a prehistoric lake monster stat sheet. Hundreds of boats were sunk with skip and dive bombing raids. In total, over 100 pilots were made into aces in P-38s. It was regularly involved in over 10-hour-long missions. Getting Yamamoto required Major John Mitchell and crew to fly over the ocean 435 miles there and back with a flight ceiling of just 50 feet. Shooting down Yamamoto is attributed to Lieutenant Rex Barber, and they escaped rapidly with just one loss on the mission. Similarly, the P-38s were also the first Allied planes over Berlin. Upon arrival, they realized that the bomber that they had been flying defense for had decided to turn back, so they cut their drop tanks and outran the German interceptors coming to get them. The plane was so great, ardent isolationist Charles Lindbergh couldn't resist and got a kill illegally when he was participating in a bomber defense operation. Lightning served admirably in all theaters of war, and during that service, many upgrades were wanted for the plane. But as it was the only long-range fighter that the US had for a long time, they wouldn't allow Lockheed to shut down production for bigger changes. The warlord also failed to procure a second manufacturing plant like they had done for the P-51, the P-47, the B-24, the B-17, and the Corsair. This meant that any changes had to be gradual, and big changes like implementing the Merlin engine that was in the later P-51s was completely out of the question. They did eventually get a second plant, but that wasn't until mid-1944, and by then the final nail in the coffin had been driven for the reputation of the P-38. After some particularly tragic raids earlier that year, General James Doolittle, now commander of the 8th Air Force in Europe, asked for the P-38, P-47, and P-51 to be assessed on a dive performance basis. This test was to be performed by RAF pilot Eric Brown, and he selected a P-38H, a P-47C, and a P-51B, which were the latest versions of each plane at the time. He found that the P-38 was only capable of diving at Mach 0.68, as we already know, but the P-47 could do 0.72 and the P-51 could do 0.78, making it the only plane that could outdive the Messerschmitt and Focke-Wulf he was comparing them to, which both could do Mach 0.75. This meant that Jimmy Doolittle could argue for the P-51 to begin replacing the other planes, which it started just in time for the legendary P-51D to make its way to the battlefield. P-38 was still highly wanted and, as I pointed out, very successful in the Pacific for the rest of the war, but as soon as the war ended, the Army couldn't wait to get rid of these things. Many of the planes that had served were ordered to be destroyed by throwing a grenade in the cockpit and then pushing it off of a cliff. Ones that weren't destroyed were sold, and a lot of planes were sold after the war, but these were sold at half the price of a P-51, despite initially costing the Army over twice the price of a P-51. There was one time South Korea wanted to buy 100 brand new P-38s that the Army had in the Philippines, but the Army convinced them to buy P-51s and then immediately scrapped the $10 million worth of unused planes that they had in storage. Like, get some money back at least. Somebody really hated these things.
He hates these cans!
As a result, only 26 of the over 10,000 planes built are still around today, and of those, only 10 are still airworthy. What was left of the projects were soon shuttered. Little bits of it would live on in spirit, as the twin nacelles inspired Harley Earl to put tail fins on Cadillacs, the front was an inspiration for a Studebaker, and the sound was used in conjunction with the P-51s for the speeders on Endor. And thus ended the life of the P-38. So, pretty simple, right? A fighter plane was made, had some issues, but was pretty good for a while, was eventually replaced by a better plane, and the sun rises and sets and the world turns. Well, not exactly. While it's true that the P-51D is a very good plane, it's really more of a comparable plane to the P-38. And this is where I start to get upset. If you look into this plane, you'll find no end to the list of articles and forum posts alike claiming that it failed to perform in Europe and was able to do its best in the Pacific, so, good for it. And that'll be stacked up against a very small contingency of P-38 truthers that are trying to fight for the legacy of this plane. I originally was going to do this video on a P-51, but after I started reading into these planes, I might have become a P-38 truther. What the hit pieces fail to mention is that after the P-51 was selected, the Army finally allowed fighter planes to leave the combat box and fly ahead to actually do their job instead of being sitting ducks in formation. This would greatly improve the effectiveness of any plane. They also leave out the part that, as I said before, the 8th Air Force didn't really know how to fly these things. And it's fine to argue that simplicity is a strong point for the P-51, but you wouldn't argue that a McLaren's a bad car just because a YouTuber barely old enough to drive binned one. And listen, I know the gravity of what I'm about to say, and I'm certainly not worthy to argue with Jimmy Doolittle. He was a far braver man than I will ever have to be, God willing. But using a metric of diving for the P-38 was a little bit on the nose. Like, it's fine to want the new, or simply want a plane that's easier to fly, or a plane that's cheaper because it was half the price, but just say that. Because while yes, the P-38 did have dive issues before the flaps were implemented, it outperformed the other planes in other metrics, particularly in climb, acceleration, firepower, as well as turning radius. Because of all the guns are in the front instead of in the wings, it also had a longer engagement range, where you'd have an average of like 600 yards of range on most fighters. The P-38 had over 1,000 yards of range. All that centered firepower also made it impossible to engage head-on. It would immediately wipe anyone out. And it was super useful for pilots like Richard Bong, who was our top ace, who for the first half of his career didn't actually know how to aim the guns. He would just get up behind somebody and rake his gun across somebody. Realistically, people are still eating up the same garbage rhetoric that followed the plane throughout its whole life. Like, setting aside the rumors surrounding it in Africa, it fought an uphill battle from the start. I already talked about how Ben Kelsey had to get creative to get the plane made in the first place, but that wasn't the end of it. It wasn't just the rules that were against long-range fighters, it was the personnel too, especially the higher-ups. And if it wasn't the fact that it was a fighter that they took issue with, it was the fact that it was a two-engine fighter. And if it wasn't a two-engine fighter, it was that it was weird-looking and had two tails. And if it wasn't that, it was some other issue, constantly. One thing after another, a different idea, a different problem people would come up with. One last note while I was editing. I forgot to mention in the original recording that another big advantage that the P-38 had was actually that it was a two-engine fighter. It might not have been appreciated by people in the European theater who, like, if something went wrong with their engine, they could bail out or make an emergency landing. But that was a pretty big deal to the guys in the Pacific theater who had nowhere to land, and if they bailed out, it was shark-infested waters they were going into. It was also useful if the plane got damaged, which is bound to happen in war. Like, if it gets shot, or that not once, but twice that it was run into a telephone pole, or the time it was run into an RAF bomber. It's just so ridiculous to ignore the advantage that the two engines gave it. When dealing with the compressibility issues that I talked about, Kelly Johnson said, quote, "I broke an ulcer over compressibility on the P-38 because we flew into a speed range where no one had ever been before, and we had difficulty convincing people that it wasn't the funny-looking airplane itself, but a fundamental physical problem." The plane faced constant criticism from onlookers who just couldn't believe that a plane of that shape, that weird plane of that weight, that size, could outfight any plane in the sky in the hands of a skilled pilot, despite multiple demonstrations showing just that. And people are still falling for it. I've seen people calling it an interceptor, despite the guy who used that word in the first place literally saying he made it up just to get past code, and the guy who designed it calling it a pursuit plane from the start. His initial offering was a pursuit plane. But people just like blame problems that they think it had, they make up problems, and then blame it on it having been an interceptor. The P-47 had the exact same problem in a dive that the P-38 had, and it was solved in the exact same way, with the little dive flaps under the wings that were invented for the P-38. The Wikipedia article for the Lightning has an entire section devoted to compressibility, and no less than 5 different references to the dive issues. You know what the P-47 article says about its dive performance? The initial response to the P-47 praised its dive speed and high altitude performance. That's it! It makes no mention that the plane had the exact same dive lock problem that the P-38 had. And it's not just the P-47 that benefited from the P-38. In fact, the transonic region and compressibility are the reason jets today have swept wings. And sure, if we didn't learn it from the P-38, maybe it would have been the P-47. Or even the P-51. Maybe, if we made it that far. Because while the P-47 had a laughably short and useless range, and the P-51 was taking 9 months off of production for just generally being bad at its job, the P-38 was showing up on the enemy's doorstep and putting in the work that needed done. So you don't need to change your mind on what your favorite World War II plane is, or what planes are important in history, but when you're talking about the Lockheed P-38 Lightning, put some respect on the name.